hello, and welcome to Recall This Book, what's a good word for this? An auxiliary episode, a spin-off episode. So I'm here with Elizabeth Ferry, and Elizabeth...
An appendage.
An appendage. Oh, an appendix episode. I like that. Okay. So this is the first time, Elizabeth, that you and I have just sat down in a room together to do this episode, which is
right. The two
weird.
Of us.
Just the two of us. Yeah. So you will have come to this because you just listened to the Zadie Smith podcast, which is great. And if you haven't, for some reason, if you came to it backwards, go back and listen to Zadie Smith first, and then
this will make a lot more sense.
Yes, this will make much more sense since we're basically a series of footnotes. Maybe that's what we are. Yeah. But so I will just say that Elizabeth and I spent more time with Zadie Smith than just is reflected in the podcast, because she actually was invited to Brandeis to spend a whole day apropos of all the freshmen reading her book Swing Time. So she came, she spoke to us on the podcast, then she spoke to a whole bunch of faculty who were going to lead discussions about Swing Time. So that was maybe 45 people, and then she spoke to a auditorium full of Brandeis undergraduates and some other folks. Mm-hmm. So we spent some time with her kind of in between, but we have like 3 public events to talk about. So we'll mainly talk about the podcast, but we will feel free to bring in interesting things that she said in any of those events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was a lot of patterns, so...
Yeah, there was a lot of patterns.
I don't think it'll be weird.
Totally. I mean, I think one thing that really struck us... Elizabeth, you were saying this earlier, she's just very on point. I mean, what she is thinking about right now, those are the topics she will raise, and she'll kind of run with them.
Yeah.
So.
And they're fascinating and beautifully expressed. So it's not like, one could imagine that being like, oh, could you please stop talking about
Here
that?
They go
you
again.
Got it. Yeah,
right.
I got it.
Yeah.
But,
right. She talked about that fear, as you mentioned. She talked about the fear of repeating herself, like that the novelist just does write the same damn thing over and over again. She said, Nabokov is somebody who does that. And in a way, what we heard her do was, run into channels that she's thinking about. But she thinks about them in really interesting ways. Yeah. And so she was in those same channels over and over, and we were delighted.
Like, without it being at all, pretending that we're friends or anything, in some sort of contrived way, she's extremely available.
Yeah.
Like, the way in which, it's sort of like when people say that somebody's a good conversationalist.
Yes.
Right? But in a way, and maybe this will speak to some of our things about authenticity and performance,
that's
but
right.
In a way that, there's no sort of, it's not like people you meet who are kind of pretending they're your best friend or something.
I agree with that.
And yet you really feel like you're invited into her thinking.
Totally.
And she's listening to you too, right?
Yeah.
So that is a lovely quality.
Right. But there was not a ton of small talk. I mean, in fact, at one point she was sitting in I'll reveal a secret of the trade, which is that you sit around in this green room in advance waiting to go on in front of the undergraduates. And I was sitting in the green room with her because I was going to interview her in front of a bunch of undergraduates. And when I walked in, she and the dean were sitting next to each other, and she was just reading Kierkegaard. She just felt like reading Kierkegaard, so that's what she's going to do. And then when she came out to the undergraduates, somebody asked a question. She's like, well, Kierkegaard has something to say about that.
I was just reading
it. Was just
yes.
It was really charming. So it's not, I think you put it really well. I mean, if we had to run through her obsessions, one of them would definitely be she has a familiar but very subtle critique of authenticity. Like, she doesn't believe in, the, kind of the deep core identity that we possess in some profound level. Mm-hmm. And made me think about Lionel Trilling making the distinction between authenticity and sincerity. And what he meant by sincerity is a form of that, what you called availability. I totally get it. Like, you're not... You are performing a little bit because you're among strangers, so there's a way you behave among strangers, but it doesn't, you're not going to lie to them. You're not going to pretend to an interest you don't feel. But on the other hand, you are going to find what the common ground is that we could share a conversation about.
Right. Yeah. And it actually also reminded me of another of her ideas that she kept returning to, which was... the way in which writers are not like or like other people. And also, by extension, the way in which artists are like and not like other people.
Totally.
Right? So, even the way both in the sense that she was talking about how novelists write the same book over and over again,
Yep.
and then she kept returning to the same ideas over and over again, and also I'm reading Kierkegaard, and then it's going to kind of naturally flow into my conversation.
Yeah. Though she also had that point about rock and rollers as people who just don't know where to quit. Like there are
Yes.
forms of art that are just like bang, bang, bang going forward. And, I kind of wanted to hear what her vision of the art that that tacks and takes into account involvement or attunement or something. But, because, maybe that
you
is the
brought that up
novel.
actually in the interview, but it was one of the balls that didn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
she
which
didn't.
normally
she didn't
happens.
Yeah. So just to run through, let's put those big obsessions on the table. So you mentioned one of them is about authenticity, and one of them is about the way that artists are performers, especially novelists are performers, but then we're all performers in our everyday life as well. So that's a version of the critique of authenticity that I think is quite subtle and distinctive.
Yes.
And then
also the at one point she says in the interview with you about sort of I believe that humans are sacred, and so in that sense I believe in a soul, but I don't believe there's some core, a soul in the sense of this core you can get down to that never, changes, right?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I'm always trying to get people to plug Hannah Arendt, and I feel like Zadie Smith did do that.
Speaking of people who have obsessions.
Yeah, exactly. But in this case, she went one better than that because she phrased in her own way, and she said this is in her mind, something that seems to me a very Arendtian problem, which is, that figuring out who someone is not like saying what they are, but it's also not as simple as just like finding that inimitable interiority, because in fact who they are is something that goes on in their interaction with others. And I gotta say, she didn't talk that much about her own fiction, because she clearly doesn't like going back, but that is what I love about her fiction. Like you see people coming out in their interaction with others that you don't, that their sides of them are revealed that they don't know.
So can I ask you, as someone who's more of an expert on the British novel than me?
Yes. But can we just name her other obsessions? Or
name the obsessions.
So I'll name the obsessions. So
but wait, before we do that,
yeah.
Just remind me to ask something about the British novel.
Yes. No, let's go right back to
it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to name the other obsession. One is what I called the golden ticket, which is the way of thinking about access to elite institutions, especially universities, which you talked about a lot, and not the faux meritocracy, but like the hypocrisy built into a so-called meritocratic system that allowed only a few people to climb out of working class education into the great free British university system. So on the one hand, she was saying, now that it's gone, let's applaud what that public university system did. And that's why she quoted people like Tony Judt, and she could have mentioned Raymond Williams or other people like that, Richard Hoggart, for the way that it was a class-crossing mechanism. So let's...
At least for a few.
For a few. But then let's also not forget the bogusness of that, because it allowed people, and she explicitly included herself, that people who did get that ticket to Cambridge to somehow feel special and not understand that, letting in 2 out of 2,000 was part of the game. And then I guess the final preoccupation that she had she's a very strong conception of what the politics of the novel should be, but they don't necessarily look like what counts as political to the younger generation, which is very woke and focused on certain kinds of cultural issues. And in fact, she was a little bit sharp with the undergraduate questioners who wanted her to sort of talk through identity categories.
Right.
And so I liked the way in which she didn't want to cede the political ground. She wanted to say, no, there's another way to think about politics that doesn't require you to go through identity categories.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and she actually brought it up in your interview, too, when she talked about sort of her affinity with Olive Kittredge. Right?
Olive Kittredge, absolutely.
Said, I have nothing, ostensibly I have nothing in common with an old white lady from Maine.
Yeah.
But
it broke my heart that she wouldn't take the bait on Willa Cather there, by the way.
I know.
I was really bummed.
You wanted her to give a PSA for Willa Cather.
That was the public service announcement I wanted. Yeah, that's true.
But anyhow, so, and this sort of idea of, and she's kind of interestingly located it in visibility, right? Like it's nothing that the affinity is nothing that you could see necessarily. And but at the same time, clearly having a, highly sophisticated and leftist critique about structure.
Yeah.
Right. So and that came out in her discussion of education. It came out in her discussion of, there was a really interesting moment with the faculty when somebody said, in talking about swing time, we've all had that experience of somebody that you grow up with who just, things don't turn out well.
Yeah.
And Smith said, well, for a lot of Black people, it is, that's like a whole neighborhood or a whole country, right? It's not just one person.
Right.
And I thought that was a really, a really strong basis from which to make politics.
I totally agree. And just to say more about that, I thought she's disavowing, and especially towards the undergraduates, she disavowed in quite straightforward terms the notion that you would have an automatic affinity or identity with people. But she also, definitely was not at all shy about referring to herself as a Black writer or talking about like the experience of being a Black Briton. And like I've read articles where she talks about like, the way in which if there's a kind of a vulnerability or a wound in the society in Britain, it's like young Black men that are going to bear the brunt of it. So it's not like she denies that those things, especially on a statistical level,
or that there are commonalities, right?
Yeah, right. That's true.
And that those commonalities have specific historical reasons.
And in a way, to go back to the golden ticket point, she said something really that I found incredibly poignant, which is she talked about getting to Cambridge. And okay, so I already mentioned, she's a sort of 2 in 2,000 figure, leaving her own school and getting to Cambridge, and then discovering that there are these schools where like 3 out of 4 people are going to end up at Oxford and Cambridge. And she talked about how hard it is to fall out of the upper middle class.
Yeah,
which, by the way, I think about all the time with people like Boris Johnson. Like, there's certain people who are just born with the assurance that whatever they do, they're going to be cushioned. Yeah. And most of the Tory party are like that, but boy, does Boris Johnson have it in spades.
I was listening to the coverage of Woodstock, because it was the 50th anniversary of Woodstock, and it was like, they didn't have a permit until like a month beforehand.
Yeah.
And then they didn't build a fence because they only had time to build either a stage or a fence. And then they ran out of food, so the army brought them food. And then, all of these things happen, and it's like, Jesus Christ, like white privilege is like we're just completely, flame out, and yet somehow this will become this iconic historical event that everybody remembers us. Because, it's okay if you don't provide for any food, because the army will come and give you food.
Yeah. And by the way, for people who haven't read Doris Lessing's The Fifth Child, I completely commend what she said about Doris Lessing, about how The Fifth Child works, as a great way of thinking about that, because that is one of those perfect, privileged childhoods that's being described, and this is perfect shiny happy couple, and then what it takes to destroy it is like a fifth child who's like literally satanic, like that that can break the family, but basically nothing else could. And Elizabeth, you and I mean, we don't need to get totally self-referential, but we're both children of academics, and we grew up in a situation where my kids go to the same school that you went to, and there's an understanding that we're part of that world where it's not like you can't fall
and easy through. And
there's just not that many holes in that floor. And Zadie Smith's point was like, well, one of the reasons there's not that many holes in that floor is that there's not that many holes in the ceiling for where I came from.
That's really well put. What I was going to ask you was what we said a few minutes ago about these sort of 2 ways of being, like the rock star, charge forward, I'm constantly self-actualized.
Yes.
And then,
which is also President Trump in her account.
Which
like
is also
people
President
who just
Trump
think being my best self is somehow an achievement.
Right. And means not just an achievement, but like a full realization of the self.
Totally,
like,
right.
That's how the self should be.
Yeah.
And then there's the other mode, which is this kind of relational, the self emerges through through interaction. And
involvement was the word I tried to throw out to her, though she didn't really bite exactly, but yeah.
No, but you just were saying that, and I agree that comes out really clearly in her prose, right? That there's this sort of way in which her characters are kind of constantly emergent through their relationships.
Yeah.
So then what I wanted to ask you was, can you give a little genealogy of the British novel that is playing with this?
Okay, so that's really interesting. So in order, yes, I can, but I would say two things about that. One is Zadie Smith, like a lot of British novelists, spends a lot of time actually praising the experimental European tradition. So she talks about Kierkegaard a lot. She actually didn't talk about Russian novels a lot.
She kind of dissed the French, though.
Yeah, in front of the undergraduates, she threw the French under the bus for not being funny. Yeah. She said the English are funny. And I thought that was revealing, because I actually do think that the sense of humor in Zadie Smith is connected to Jane Austen. And it's connected to Muriel Spark, who she praised. She praised Girl of Slender Means, which Steve Macaulay and I talked about on the podcast, because Muriel Spark is totally brilliant mid-century comic novelist. So there's a tradition of kind of like humanistic warmth, where basically you see characters in their foibles, but you nonetheless like embrace them in that. I think she belongs to that, but I think she wants to locate herself.
And Forster definitely belongs.
And Forster totally belongs to that, right? Actually, I think Zadie Smith is a lot funnier than Forster. Forster tries to be funny; he does not succeed the way Zadie Smith succeeds. I think she's left her whatever I was going to say master, but that's not the right word. She's left her old instructor behind in that regard. But and Virginia Woolf is really not funny at all.
No.
I'm going to get hate mail for that, but
tradition.
I guess Lucky Jim. It's a different kind of funny. That's minor. Yeah,
it's so fucking funny. Though.
It is,
but it's a different kind of funny too. It's not like sort of the foibles. Actually, Trollope is. Well,
Trollope is, but I was going to say the other person she mentions, which I think is completely fair, is she raved about Hilary Mantel, and that's when she mentioned Muriel Spark. And the point there would be that Hilary Mantel is someone who, even before she was required to write a historical novel in order to become famous, she nonetheless was able to, see characters in a sort of funny, sideways way. I actually would put Penelope Fitzgerald in that category too. But what I was going to say is that Zadie Smith definitely wants to link herself more to a European experimental novel tradition, which would be like the Nouveau Roman, people like Robbe-Grillet. She mentioned this book, now I'm forgetting the name, what's it called? The Bathroom?
The Bathroom?
Yeah, which I don't know at all, but it's clearly an experimental Belgian novel. And in her famous Two Paths for the Novel, she, basically says lyric realism is really boring and stodgy, and the experimental novel is this like richer way to go.
Odd,
I agree. So I think it's odd, and I mean I'm glad Zadie Smith is not here, and maybe she won't even listen to this, because I think it's odd. I think it's not bad faith, but I think she's trying to describe something that she isn't.
More like
that's exactly. I totally agree.
Realist,
yeah. So she belongs to this. Like she throws Joseph O'Neill's Netherland under the bus in that essay, but honestly, that novel is not so far from the world of how Zadie Smith realizes her characters and puts them into play with one another.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. So I think I think there's like a nominal genealogy for Zadie Smith, which is real because it's the people you think about when you're writing. But then there's a kind of shadow genealogy, which you can tell includes Woolf and Foster. I think the reason that the E.M. Forster and Virginia Woolf comparison continues to be made and it resonates is actually that they are very unusual in the English novel tradition in being great essayists as well. Like Forster, like I mentioned the book on the novel, but he has a bunch of other essays as well. Virginia Woolf has a famous book of essays called The Common Reader. You could think about The Room of One's Own is essentially an argued essay. And she was very aware, like when she answered my first question about not going back to her own novels.
And the Moments of Being.
Oh, yeah, and Moments of Being, right, which we've discussed already on the podcast. Yeah. Oh, my God. It is an echo chamber. But Zadie Smith herself made the point that she can go back to her essays because they're argumentative. So she makes a distinction in her mind. Yeah. And which I completely get. I mean, as somebody who is only capable of writing the argumentative stuff and not the fictional stuff, I like that a novelist also thinks of those two things as two different, two different
realms. And a novel that tries to make an argument in that kind of way is usually not a very good.
Actually, and I think that comes back to something, Elizabeth, you said before, but let's unpack it a bit more, which is that so Zadie Smith is acute in that she sees what is the problems that people have, but to say that she's generous also means that she is she will never cancel anyone. So, do you want to talk about that response to a student?
Well, I mean, it had to do with this this character Amy, who's in Swing Time, and
she's Madonna, isn't she? Or,
yeah,
she's Madonna.
Yeah.
So, global do-gooder, doesn't really think too much about what she's doing when she's doing good. But,
and sort of constantly having a circle around her who are sort of her friends,
yes,
and whose job it is to be her friends and to cater to her.
Yes, paid friends. Yes,
yes,
poorly paid friends. Yeah,
right. And it's it's kind of buffoonish. It's kind of caricatured, not in a bad way. I think it's good, but an undergraduate asked a question about it, and she sort of Zadie Smith kind of asserted her philosophy towards her kind of humanism.
Yeah. And fictional humanism, by the way, but yeah.
Yeah.
Because she was interested in them. She said fiction is the way to do. Well, go ahead and say the humanism, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I didn't get the sense. I mean, that seemed to be a point when she was actually crossing over from fiction.
Oh, I see.
To,
she was not just talking about characters.
She wasn't just talking about characters, right?
Yeah.
And she sort of, said, I'm not one of these people who can be like, I just can't with someone.
Yeah. She waved her hand in I can't with, right? Yeah, she's a very good mimic, actually.
Yeah, she's quite a good performer. And she, and there was a little bit of a generational thing in there too. Like it was definitely like speaking to a group of college students and finding some opportunities to assert a particular point of view about, contemporary social life.
Yeah. So Elizabeth, final question, what did we do wrong? What should we have asked her? Should we have pressed her? Is there something we should have pressed her on more? Other than making her read Will Cather.
I wanted to hear more about, and I don't think we should have pressed her necessarily because it was, getting into the weeds and various, especially in front of either in the faculty or the undergraduate part. But I would have liked to hear more about novels and specificities of novels and stuff. And I
agree. She was terrific on Hilary Mantel. She was terrific on Miro Spark.
And I just like her forthrightness about what she likes and doesn't like and why and sort of these, even though I didn't either, maybe I didn't agree or I just didn't understand some of the genealogies that she was tracing. I just really enjoyed hearing that. And I actually wanted to bring in, I did have a conversation with her about the way, John and I teach a class from time to time of novels and ethnographies. And I was telling her about that, and we were sort of talking a little bit about novels and why novels are different from ethnographies and stuff. And, I think that sort of leads into a conversation more about what the novel can do. And actually, I was just going to say that, just to circle back around to what we were saying about Jane Austen and her kind of everything working out and being very systematic.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because that is characteristic of a certain kind of ethnography. And, particularly within a kind of structuralist tradition.
Yeah, right.
Whereas somebody like George Eliot with Middlemarch is much more of a sort of Malinowskian kind of,
Teaching it next week. Very excited.
Good, yeah. So I think that would be interesting to talk more with her.
And actually, there is a thread I should have picked up on more, except I was afraid of sounding too much like an English professor. But she mentioned Philip Roth several times, and that's a really interesting comparison because she clearly does identify with American fiction in ways that we could have teased out more. And the Roth comparison, because talk about someone who writes about twins. I mean, he has the double life, the counterpart, the ghost, exit ghost. Like so many of his novels are structured on the parallel lives that either get involved or are mirrors of one another. Right. And I think that's what she likes about him. I mean, I do think that's the affinity.
And on that note?
Okay, on that note, so I will just say thank you for listening to this episode of Recall This Book. As always, our music is courtesy of Eric Cheslow and Barbara Cassidy. We are grateful to Claire Ogden and Matthew Schratz for all of their editorial and technical and other production assistance. And please, please, please tell your friends about this, tell your relatives about this, tell people you don't like about it, and rate us or give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. We get no money. We just want to get the word out, and so the best way for that to happen is by word of mouth. So from all of us here, Elizabeth, you and me in a room together.
That's right. Yeah.
I feel if we were Zadie Smith, we would sing, but I guess we can't sing. But we'll say so long, farewell. Okay.
And thanks.
Good night.